Okay, so now we're going to look a little more deeply at who God is as our compassionate God. So, this is really essentially what I would call meditating on God. When I'm meditating on the Lord and who He is, these are just some things that I do. I mean, obviously, I put it into sort of this process to be able to explain it. It's not. I don't sit down with slides when I'm doing it myself, but I do consider these things in my own thoughts. So I thought I would put it together in such a way to offer it as options for other people to think about if it's something that you are um, wanting to do. Some people ask me questions about meditating on God and what that means, especially because my background includes a lot of meditation in the wrong way. So I've learned how to meditate on in the right way biblically. So, anyway, going forward, let's talk more about meditating on God and His compassion. So, as we let the things that we're going to continue to discuss about God and His compassion sink in, I think it would be a good thing to consider that we're not just talking about compassion on its own. When we're talking about compassion, we're compounding it with the attributes of God. Compassion is one of his attributes, but now we're adding, the total, all of God, who God is. And I'm going to be talking about a few of God's attributes here, certainly not limited to these, but these are just some things that, when I think about God's compassion, keeping in mind, make me realize how really grand and amazing God's compassion is. So, another thing to remember when we're thinking about compassion and God is that his emotions are perfect. So he's not like us in this way, right? Our emotions are not perfect. Oftentimes, our emotions don't match what we know is the right thing to do. Sometimes our emotions are inconsistent with the truth. And I'm not saying emotions aren't useful, they are indicators. And so, emotions, God did make emotions. They're not, emotions are not something to be ignored, but our emotions are not, they're fallen, they are not perfected. While we are being conformed into the image of Christ, our emotions are still subject to being um, being imbalanced with the truth. And so we have to be conscious of that and recognize that we cannot make decisions based on emotion. That's not an issue for God. Everything, he does, it does say the Bible uses emotions to describe times that God experiences things, grief, right? Is in the Bible. So we know that God also has emotions in his own way. I don't know exactly, what that looks like, but there are emotive words that describe God's position at times, or his response. But it's important to recognize that because his emotions are perfect, he has no issues with the sort of harmony that goes on between emotions that we tend to struggle with. So sometimes, we might have a sense of justice, but we also have a sense of compassion. And for people, sometimes those things can be out of balance, or we might have a pendulum swing where we're being too compassionate, and or we're being too empathetic rather, and we're not necessarily being discerning. God's combination of all of these things are perfect all the time. He doesn't struggle with those things the way that we do. So when we're thinking about God as compassionate, we can know that his compassionate response is always coming from a place of perfection. His um his initial response of compassion is perfect, and his follow through with what he chooses to do with that compassion is perfect. He's not swayed by anything like we are as people. So we can also be certain that when we earnestly cry out, his compassionate response is real. It's his attitude toward us. He has an attitude of compassion because he tells us that he does, and because he is unchangeable and his word is true and he is who he says he is. We don't have to be afraid that, he might change his mind when we cry out to him and we need help in something. And we don't have to be afraid that, well, he might feel for me but he might not actually help me, right? We of course have to be open and reasonable to what that looks like. It might not always be the response that we want or that we think could should be, because our minds are finite and he really does know what's best. But we can be sure that his attitude toward us is one of compassion at all times. Oh, let me just go back there. Sorry. So for this slide, I did list what we're going to go through some of these attributes when we're thinking about compassion. We're going to talk about how God is dependable, caring, faithful, and able. And like I mentioned, obviously, God is not limited to these things, but I just selected these few things, these few traits that God has that we want to consider when thinking about his compassion, because it just shows how amazing and expansive his compassion really is when you combine it with even just these four attributes of God. So I'm going to leave this slide with Psalm 18, verse 30. It says, as for God, his way is perfect. The Lord's word is flawless, and he shields all who take refuge in him. So this is a promise. He tells us in his word that he shields all who take refuge in him and that his way is perfect. So we can be assured of that when we're meditating on our compassionate God. So, looking at the attribute of God that is dependable. So, God is dependable. And it says in James 1:17, every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, which with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. So again, there is no variation or shifting shadow when it comes to God, because he is dependable and therefore is also dependable when it comes to God being compassionate toward us. God is also caring. So it says in 1 Peter 5:6 through 7, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. So here we have, it is written, he cares for you. He cares for us. Wow. This is one of those. I'm going to do a little side note here because in previous videos, I have been mentioning sort of that challenge question of, do you really believe this, right? So I want to give a little personal brief story. This is something I really struggled with. I really struggled with up until not that long ago, truthfully, with, does God really care for me? And I knew that it was written, and I would, preach the scriptures to myself and I would say it. But I realized that my response to life was one that I was afraid sometimes that God didn't really care, that he heard me, but he didn't really care for me. And that's the truth. I really struggled with that. And it bothered me because I knew that that couldn't be true. It was inconsistent with what was written, but it was, I really struggled with believing it for various reasons, I suppose. And so when I admitted finally that I really don't believe this as I would like to, or as it is written, I went to the Lord in prayer on it, and he has convinced me through, seeking him in prayer. I am now convinced that God actually cares about me. And that is a miracle, a total miracle, because that was an area that I was very hardened in, and I'm not anymore. There's real freedom there. And so I was only able to experience that in this instance anyway. I don't think it's limited, but in this instance, I was only able to experience that when I was honest and I said, I believe, but help my unbelief, because I do still have unbelief. And the Lord in his mercy convinced my heart that he cares for me. And so we can be sure when we're considering God's compassion and meditating on it, that we're not just talking about a God who's compassionate and doing what's right because it's the right thing to do. God actually cares. He's moved to compassion and he acts because he cares for us. Next, we have faithful. So God is faithful. It says in Isaiah 49:15, can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child that she has born? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. I love this because it's very, very clear. God is telling us he will not forget us. He is faithful. Even, mothers can walk away. I know it's unusual and uncommon, but we are fallible and God is not. And He is perfectly faithful, um, even if we are faithless, even when we struggle and we struggle with our faith. God is faithful. And if we continue to, humble ourselves before Him, He will show us compassion, and that is what he tells us in the scriptures, because we are dust. He knows, and he has promised to conform us into the image of His Son, as I mentioned in a previous video. So anyway, got a little sidetracked there, but I do want to put here. I put a little arrow because it has a fun little note that in this verse. So it says, "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion?" That word compassion is rachamim, which, if you remember from a previous video, is the Hebrew word, and the root word there is womb. So I just thought that was a fun fact to throw in. All right, so our last slide in this series of looking at the attributes of God when we're considering compassion, things to keep in mind, is able. So God is able, and our scripture here is Romans 8:28 through 29, and it says, "He works all things for the good of those who love Him and who have been called according to His purpose." For those God foreknew, He also predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, so that He might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. So, God is able to do all things, and nothing is impossible with Him. And we have actually been called according to His purpose. And He is able to conform us into the image of His Son. And so I have little notes here. I have, do you believe this? Right? Do you believe God is able? Do your actions and your feelings reflect this belief? And I think that this is one I chose to put this little arrow here because I think sometimes, this is a very popular verse. Many people, many Christians know this verse, but this sometimes when we know something so well and we say it really often, we don't really think about what we're saying. And so I wanted to put this here as a pause moment, like a moment of reflection for you to consider, do you really believe God is able? And do you really believe that God is able and compassionate? And putting those things together, and then reflecting also on ways that you've seen these God be compassionate, and these other attributes that we talked about: caring, faithful, able, and dependable, how you've seen them in your own life, and combining those with compassion so that you can begin to build that memory, that working knowledge of who God is in your life, would be something that I'd encourage you to do at this time. All right.